Okay, welcome back to part 2 of the Lesson 5 lecture, and this part is on U.S. imperialism. Between the 1860s and 1890s, as America was consolidating its control over the western frontier and the Native Americans there, many of the leading nations of the world were colonizing and setting up global empires. Several developments helped shift American attention to the lands across the seas. So, what were the motivations for creating an overseas American empire? Which, let's be honest, people at the time openly admitted that this is what they were creating. No one was really that ashamed to have an empire. It's what all the cool people did. All the great European powers had their own empires. They called them empires. People didn't apologize for, having a kind of domineering, control over the world, over parts of the world. It was a very different time and place. Not necessarily. I'm not saying it was for the better. I would argue it was for the worst that people didn't recognize these empires as problematic. But nevertheless, people openly talked about establishing an empire. So how did they justify it? One reason was the need to access markets and raw materials. As always, trade and money were the primary driving force of this political change. Foreign trade became very important during the 1890s and 1900s. $392 million in foreign trade in 1870, but by 1900 that number had increased to $1.4 billion for the U.S. Without a strong global presence, America would have little ability to retaliate against foreign countries if their governments were to put up tariffs taxing American exports. Foreign countries might also want to tax and regulate American companies involved in the extraction of raw materials in their lands. Under pressure from frustrated peasants, Latin American governments sometimes demanded hefty taxes and rents in exchange for American companies being allowed to use their fruit plantation lands. In some cases, nationalist Latin American governments attempted to seize and redistribute the foreign-owned American property outright. In other cases, peasants seized the Yankee-owned land themselves, and their governments were either unwilling or unable to enforce American claims on these properties. Thus began the Banana Wars, a series of invasions and occupations of several countries, such as Nicaragua, Honduras, and the Dominican Republic, by U.S. Marines in the early 1900s in order to collect debts owed to Americans and enforce American property claims in the Caribbean, such as those lands owned by America's United Fruit Company. They did this in situations when the native governments were either unable or unwilling to do it themselves to reestablish order, protect this property. Hence the cartoon below showing Theodore Roosevelt in the Caribbean leading around a flotilla of American ships labeled Debt Collector, going around to Mexico, Santo Domingo, Panama, everywhere. In the Pacific, American companies feared that local authorities or rival European empires might demand fees for the use of their ports by America's shipping companies. Cheap access to ports and refueling stations in the Pacific was increasingly important to America as trade with China boomed. This was one pivotal role that the Philippines played for the United States after the U.S. captured those islands from Spain in 1898. As the cartoon below says, after all, the Philippines are only the stepping stone to China. You see right here. See Uncle Sam going to China, using the Philippines as a stepping stone. He's got things to sell, education, religion, all sorts of things. Second motivation was competition with European empires. Many Americans feared that if America did not acquire overseas colonies, then rival European empires such as Britain or France would get them instead. So even if one were inclined to see territories in the Pacific and Latin America rule themselves independently, such a scenario was simply not seen as a realistic option. Americans' fears of being shut out of the Pacific seemed to be coming true when European empires in the late 1800s started to carve up China. Britain, France, and Germany began claiming exclusive control over various port cities such as Hong Kong and Tianjin. American merchants faced the possibility of being restricted from trading in various ports. The Chinese government, the Qing dynasty, was too disorganized to fight back and was arguably more afraid of the democratic aspirations of its own people than of the rival European powers. So the Qing rulers were quite willing to give away parts of China if it meant European support for that shaky monarchy of theirs. In 1900, a nationalist rebellion broke out in China. Europeans and Americans called it the Boxer Rebellion because some of the rebels were martial artists who claimed to have ancient Chinese fighting techniques that would overcome the Europeans and their guns. The Boxer Rebellion aimed to liberate China from foreign control. In response, European empires organized an 8-nation alliance to put down the rebellion and make sure that the pliable Qing government remained in firm control of China. The Qing government actually hesitantly supported the Boxer Rebellion in order to preserve some of its credibility among its own people, because it was a very popular cause. But the Qing government's help to the rebels was half-hearted and, I would say, conveniently ineffectual. America contributed thousands of Marines to this 8-nation alliance to put down the Boxer Rebellion. America thereby secured the good graces of its European rivals, since they were all helping to help put down this rebellion. And America secured an agreement to an open door policy, which guaranteed that American merchants would be allowed to trade in European-controlled ports in China. Here you see Uncle Sam happy that he's secured this open door to China. Third motivation for empire was something that a British poet by the name of Rudyard Kipling called the white man's burden. And this idea had to do with the fact that many Americans believed that America's growing strength was a sign of the superiority of America's culture and way of life. As you read in the previous lesson, the idea of social Darwinism had a sizable influence in America leading up to the year 1900. According to this idea of the survival of the fittest, America's conquest of the Native Americans was a sign that America's way of life was vastly superior. Might makes right, as the saying went. Similarly, if America could conquer and rule over other backward peoples, it was only fair and, in fact, beneficial for those backward peoples to take some lessons from America. Many Americans professed to believe that it was America's duty to civilize and Christianize foreign peoples. Whether this belief was proclaimed because those Americans really believed it, or because it conveniently rationalized conquests that aimed to promote America's own interests, it's difficult to say. But here's a political cartoon showing that concept of Uncle Sam teaching these natives what's good for them. You know, since they are not ready, allegedly, to rule themselves, they need to be held as a U.S. protectorate for a while. And you also have Native Americans here in this cartoon. You have Chinese. You have a very racist caricature of African Americans. And then you have the far more civilized whites here. Very racist cartoon. The captions, basically, with the captions, you have the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Here in the front row, they're the problem children who need extra special attention. They're the most backward, and allegedly, according to this cartoon. And the caption says, "School begins." And Uncle Sam says, "Now, children, you've got to learn these lessons, whether you want to or not. But just take a look at the class ahead of you and remember that in a little while you will feel as glad to be here as they are. So, you know, just stick in there and be obedient little children, and we'll teach you how to govern yourselves." It's kind of the idea there. The fourth motivation for empire was to create a feeling of national unity and distraction from internal divisions. For example, Theodore Roosevelt, who led the Rough Riders Volunteer Cavalry Regiment in Cuba, called the Spanish-American War a splendid little war because he had no doubts that America would easily win it, and because he knew that success in this war would increase American power, unify Americans around national pride, and distract Americans from class conflicts and other divisions at home. So those were the motivations for empire. How did the U.S. attain its empire? First step, or one of the steps, and probably the most important, was the Spanish-American War. Spain began attracting a lot of negative attention in the American media in the late 1800s. Spain was a decaying empire and was thus a tempting target for America to take advantage of. Spain was also committing frequent atrocities in trying to subdue the independence movements in its overseas colonies, especially in Cuba, right across the ocean from Florida. American newspapers ran frequent headlines vilifying the Spanish government for its harsh punishment of Cuban revolutionaries. American investors also watched nervously as tens of millions of dollars in American investments in Cuba were threatened with becoming collateral damage in the battle between Spain and Cuba's insurgents. However, America was not about to launch an aggressive war against Spain without a direct attack from Spain on the U.S. So the event that finally gave the U.S. government a convincing justification for starting a war that it had wanted to start for several years running was an explosion that sank the USS Maine, an American battleship that happened to be sitting provocatively in Havana Harbor just off the coast of Cuba, which was Spanish territorial waters. Spain claimed to have no responsibility for the attack, and later evidence has suggested that it might have been caused by an internal explosion in the ship itself. Nevertheless, Americans did not wait around for ironclad proof before rushing to blame Spain for the attack, and the war was on. On paper, the Spanish military outnumbered America's military, but everybody knew that Spain's troops were already undersupplied, demoralized, and exhausted from fighting anti-Spanish insurgents in Cuba and the Philippines over the preceding decades. Spain's navy also stood no chance against the all-steel navy that America had been building since the 1880s. In 1898, the U.S. had the fifth largest navy in the world, and by 1900, it was the third largest. And Spain was quite a bit farther down the list. Victory in this splendid little war ended up giving the U.S. Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines as colonies. Although, in the case of the Philippines, the native peasants were not happy to see the U.S. kick Spain out, only to then stick around and become the new imperial overlord. So in order to stay in the Philippines, the U.S. had to fight a 3-year-long revolt that cost America over 4,000 deaths and that caused possibly hundreds of thousands of Filipino deaths. There are no really certain numbers on that death toll. But here's a political cartoon from the time showing Americans wanting to expand their power, looking for a convenient time to pounce on Spain. Here's the menu of possibilities, things they could take from Spain: Cuba, Cuba steak, Puerto Rico pig. Uncle Sam says, "Well, I hardly know which to take first. They all sound so delicious." Once again, people were pretty open about the fact that the U.S. was creating an empire. They didn't hide it. They were pretty open about it and unapologetic about it. The U.S. might have even annexed Cuba as well, because Cuba is another territory the U.S. captured in the Spanish-American War. But legislators forced President McKinley to agree to the Teller Amendment, which promised that Cuba would be recognized as an independent country after the U.S. kicked Spain out of Cuba. However, before the U.S. Army left Cuba, the U.S. forced Cuba to insert the Platt Amendment into Cuba's constitution, which granted the U.S. control over Cuba's economic policies and the right to use Guantanamo Bay as a naval base, which Cubans were not happy about. And this is the beginning of Cubans being angry about what they called Yankee imperialism, which they're still mad about, a lot of them, even today. Second way in which the U.S. attained its empire was through expansion in the Pacific Ocean. Getting more naval bases was also a major objective in America's colonization plans in the Pacific. Besides Manila Bay in the Philippines, the U.S. gained fine harbors in Hawaii and American Samoa. Hawaii had been an important stopping point for U.S. ships on their way to China. Missionaries arrived, then American planters who started sugar plantations, who exported their sugar to America duty-free, meaning not subject to tariffs. The Navy began looking at Pearl Harbor as a permanent base. In 1899, the Hawaiians agreed to let the U.S. to use Pearl Harbor as a naval base. But Queen Liliuokalani led the Hawaiian nationalist movement to oust the Americans. After the McKinley Tariff imposed a high tariff on sugar from Hawaii, the American planters there decided the only way to keep making money was to become part of the U.S. so that they would no longer be subject to the tariff. So they staged a rebellion, overthrew the Queen, aided by U.S. Marines in Pearl Harbor, and requested annexation, eventually granted by the McKinley administration in 1898. Also, Americans had been settling on the islands and slowly taking control away from the natives. Hawaii was finally annexed into the United States in 1898, although it did not become a full-fledged state until after World War II, technically. It was a protectorate or a territory up until that point. The Samoan Islands, which are about 3,000 miles south of Hawaii, were also vital to American shipping and an important stop for American vessels. However, Germany and Britain were also interested in the islands. The Samoan princes secured treaties with all three nations. All three nations spent the next 10 years trying to take control of the islands. Finally, in 1899, Germany and the U.S. split the islands and gave Britain territory elsewhere in the Pacific as a concession. The third way in which the U.S. attained an empire was through various formal, or I should say informal mechanisms of enforcing control, what we might call an informal empire. So while the U.S. outright annexed many small territories in the Pacific, most Latin American countries did not become outright colonies of the United States. However, the U.S. did maintain control over Latin American governments and economies by exercising the constant threat of U.S. intervention if those countries antagonized the U.S. government. This was part of America's informal empire in the Caribbean and Central America, which the U.S. has arguably maintained ever since. For example, the first map shows American interventions in the early 1900s, and the second map shows more recent American interventions in Latin America. So let's look at this first map. It shows interventions in Cuba, such as during the Spanish-American War, but even afterwards, to make sure that they weren't passing any laws that were against U.S. business interests. 1906, 1917, U.S. Marines were showing up constantly. Same thing in Mexico, same thing in Nicaragua, Honduras, Dominican Republic, and so on. And then even recently, since after World War II, this has continued, really. And a lot of Americans are not aware of these interventions. Things like the Bay of Pigs invasion to try to overthrow the Cuban government in 1961. This invasion failed. Cuba's communist government remained. But, for example, this one succeeded. The U.S. did manage to overthrow this government in Guatemala in 1954, which was going to nationalize, basically take away lands owned by United Fruit Company. El Salvador funding right-wing militias, Honduras removing governments that from power that the U.S. didn't like, Chile helping the military there overthrow a democratically elected socialist president, and just on and on it goes. There have been attempts even recently, like in Venezuela, to try to overthrow that government. The U.S. hasn't gone so far as to, send U.S. Marines in, but the U.S. has given encouragement and tried to give money to opposition groups in Venezuela. So the U.S. meddles in Latin America still quite a bit even today. Even recently, like in Haiti in 2004, U.S. Marines went in and occupied Haiti briefly, which hardly anyone pointed out at the time. The media did not really even draw much attention to these sorts of things because it's not in our day and age. It's not polite to acknowledge that a country has an empire or interferes and meddles in other countries to such an extent. Empires are not cool anymore. It's so the U.S. has to kind of be a little more careful and not be so blatant, although still does quite a few instances of these interventions, but they're less talked about and openly bragged about, I guess, nowadays. So that is those are the origins of U.S. imperialism. I look forward to discussing this in this week's discussion board. So see you there.